Awesome. Well, thank you, Francis, for the really kind introduction. My name's Nathan again. I'm really excited to be speaking with you all here today about some research I conducted in Greater Yellowstone this past summer, focused on plants. So thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I have lots of people to thank and funding sources to acknowledge. So first, starting with the funding, I want to acknowledge that we received funding from the UW-Madison Vilas Trust, the Joint Fire Science Program GRIN, the National Park Service Reserve Funds, and the National Science Foundation, all of which was kind of cobbled together and supported different aspects of last summer's field season, but was still vital to the success of it. There's also quite a few people that I want to thank, and if y'all will indulge me, I do want to go and name some folks that were important to the field season success. In the top left corner, on the left is Diane Abendroth, who is on this call. Diane is the fire ecologist with Grand Teton National Park. She's come in the field with us. She's a great collaborator and friend, and she is the one who introduced us or introduced me to Francis, and is why I'm here. So thank you, Diane. And pictured with her is Dr. Kristen Berjunis, a recent graduate of the lab that I'm in here at UW-Madison. Kristen has similarly been a great friend, a great mentor, and her and I kind of co-led this past field season together. And without her, I definitely feel like it would have been quite different. I also want to thank the two folks in the top middle picture. In the middle, that's Julia Warren, and on the right is Nick Tipper. Those were our field assistants this last summer. If the picture is any indication, they were wonderful and did a great job at helping us collect the data we needed to collect. In addition, there's some other folks, present and past members of the Turner Lab, Aria Link, Timon Keller, Dr. Tyler Hecker, who came out for part of the field season to help, collaborators at the University of Montana, Dr. Corey Cleveland and Robbie Human, a fire ecologist, Becky Smith up at Yellowstone National Park, Diane's fire effects crew, Dr. Bill Rami, who is also on this call, is professor emeritus at Colorado State, and was kind enough to donate some of his retirement time and teach me some plants at the beginning of my field season. And of course, I also want to thank my advisor, Dr. Monica Turner, for continued support and really being the one making all of this possible. I also, before we start, just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of Indigenous nations and tribes that have past and current connection to Greater Yellowstone. And this map, to some extent, does a disservice to that connection because it does show all of their reservations kind of scattered away from the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. That is, of course, a result of forced removal during the creations of the national parks. So don't let that fool you. These indigenous nations and tribes still have a strong present day connection to this area. And I just want to acknowledge that this research that I'm going to be talking about does take place or did take place on lands that they have called home since time immemorial. All right, so just to situate us first, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, an area that many of you on this call are familiar with, but you just want to touch on some of the key points first. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is this extensive, intact wild landscape at the intersection of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, centered on Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks with surrounding wilderness and national forest areas. It's incredibly well known for its scenic beauty, Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, the Teton mountain range, for its wildlife, grizzly bears, wolves. I even saw an article recently about a wolverine sighting in Yellowstone National Park, which is really cool. And of course, for its unique thermal features that draws millions of people to these parks every year, and is also really important to the people of the communities in Greater Yellowstone, such as Jackson, West Yellowstone, Gardner, Cook City, and others in the area. Greater Yellowstone is also a landscape that is shaped by fire. Pictured here are just a small section of the 1988 Yellowstone fires. This image was taken up in Yellowstone National Park looking across the Madison River, so a little bit east of West Yellowstone. And fires have been very important on the landscape for the last 10,000 plus years, really since the glaciers receded. And so to some extent, this is similar to what is the case across much of the Western United States, right? But the fire regime in Greater Yellowstone is somewhat different to fire regimes elsewhere, like you think about in California or the Southwestern United States. These fires tend to be infrequent historically, so occurring every 100 to 300 years. And when they do occur, they are often very large. They are severe in stand replacing, meaning that there is really high or complete tree mortality. That's indicated on this image on the right of your screen that was taken by my advisor, Dr. Monica Turner, from a helicopter soon after the 1988 Yellowstone fires. All of the black you see, those are completely charred and dead trees. So complete stand replacing, complete tree mortality. But you're also seeing tree mortality in those browned edges. Those are just areas where the tree or the fire didn't get up into the canopy of the tree, so the needles didn't burn, but it was hot enough along the forest floor that the trees still died. An important thing to note too about these fire regimes is that they're driven primarily by climate conditions. Of course, fuels are important. There needs to be something there to burn, but climate is what is really contributing to whether or not an area is going to burn or we're going to have a big fire year, and then how extensively fires might be expected to burn. So these forests, though, are resilient to this historical fire regime. And by resilient, I mean they're able to return to some pre-fire state. This is owing to largely two factors, depending on whether you're thinking about the overstory, the canopy, or the understory. Focusing on the canopy first, a big characteristic of lodgepole pine, the dominant or one of the dominant tree species in the region, especially on the Yellowstone Plateau and a bit into Grand Teton National Park, is this trait called serotiny, which you can see pictured on the bottom picture. That's when the tree, after it reaches a certain age, forms these closed cones. They're sealed by resin that are only opened by fire. So when a fire comes through, all of these cones open that have been hanging out in the canopy. And after the fire moves through, there's this nice exposed bare mineral soil that those seeds disperse down into, seedlings establish, and it often leads to really rapid and really robust forest recovery. Thinking about resilience in the understory too is important. Interestingly, despite the severity and intensity of many of these fires, they don't burn very deeply into the soil. So a lot of underground structures of understory plants are actually able to survive the fire. Just the tops are burned off. And so within the first couple of years after fire, there's really robust resprouting from these underground roots and rhizomes of these plants. And you can kind of see this through time represented really nicely by this National Geographic graphic on the right of your screen, where soon after fire, it looks kind of like a moonscape. 1 year after fire, you start to see some things coming back. Within a couple years after fire, some of the understory is flowering and producing seeds, which will then contribute to the next generation. And within the first few decades after fire, you have a really dense thicket of lodgepole pine, especially in those areas of high serotiny. So in short, these forests are well adapted to this fire regime. So what does this actually look like, though, through time? The National Geographic is a nice visual representation of that, but I do want to take a look at some aerial imagery, historical moving up to the present, to see what this looks like. So this is aerial imagery from 1988, focused on the John D. Rockefeller Memorial Parkway, which is just south of Yellowstone and just north of Grand Teton, right between the two parks. And as we move through these pictures, I just want you to focus in on this blue box. So as I've kind of alluded to, our year is 1988. So what's going to come next is the 1988 Yellowstone fires. This is just a really small portion of the vast expanse of the area affected by the Yellowstone fires, but will be useful for illustrating our point here. If we look 4 years after the Yellowstone fires, you can see some of that burn scar. And I think it shows up even more interestingly by 2000, I think just owing to the quality of the imagery. But it's pretty stark. You can still see it's almost like the fires just stamped out a section of the forest, killed off all the trees, and the recovery is not visible by satellite yet. But as we give it more time, by 2010, starting to see some greening coming back. And then by 2016, I think that if I removed that blue box, you might have a hard time actually drawing the outline of at least this section of the Yellowstone fires. So by 28 years after fire, there was quite a bit of recovery. And of course, on the ground, all these trees are much shorter. You can still see the impact of the fire, but it's well on its way to recovering to forest. However, climate and fire are changing. This is the case in Greater Yellowstone, as is the case in many other places throughout the world. Since the early 1980s, temperatures have warmed in Yellowstone National Park by over 2 degrees Celsius. And this is contributing to observed and expected increasingly frequent fire. I do want to take a minute just to kind of walk through this graph on the right. So this is some modeling work that was done and published in 2011. And what you're seeing is an image of the Greater Yellowstone, and the color ramp is moving from cool colors to warmer colors. And it's a ramp of fire rotation, which is basically the amount of time it takes to burn a given area. So your cooler colors are the longer fire rotations, exceeding, in this case, over 120 years. And your warmer colors are your shorter fire rotations, in this case, less than 10 years. And what we see, driven by climate, is that by the end of the century, we're projected to have drastically shortened fire rotations across Greater Yellowstone, such that almost every year, climate is going to be right for a big fire season. And this is contributing to what we're expecting to see is just really more frequent fire on the landscape. This is already happening in Greater Yellowstone, including in Grand Teton National Park. For those who are in the area and have been for some time, you might know what I'm about to show you next. This is 2016. And what occurred in 2016 was the largest fire year since 1988 in Greater Yellowstone, where up north in Yellowstone National Park, the maple fire burned a big area, and further south in Grand Teton, the berry fire burned. And this is the berry fire, part of the berry fire that I'm showing you here. And what's cool, in a sense, about this having occurred where it did, is that the berry fire in 2016, this is its imprint, it reburned some areas that had burned in 1988. So some of that younger forest that was only 28 years old when it burned, and it burned some older forest that was mature when it burned. And so now we have this opportunity to look at these two types of post-fire areas. Those following short interval fire, so those areas that burned in 1988 and again in 2016, less than 30 years between fire, and those that burned in long interval fires, those that burned mature forests that were greater than 125 years old when they burned. And so what does this actually look like on the ground? This is two images of forests after long interval fire, both taken last summer in 2021. On the left, this is an image of 5 years after the berry fire. So we see lots of tall standing dead snags that were part of that mature forest before the fire. And that lush green carpet, though it might be a little hard to make out, is dominated largely by lodgepole pine seedlings and quite a bit of fireweed. On the right is kind of where that forest might be heading given enough time. That's 12 years after the Bear Paw Bay fire. I talked about how serotiny contributes to really dense recovery of lodgepole pine. There is your dense recovery of lodgepole pine. It's we call it dense town. It's incredible actually how many trees can be packed into a given area. That's Diane and Kristen for scale. So keep these images in mind when I flip to the next slide, because now we're going to look at areas after short interval fire. Again, both of these pictures were taken in 2021 in the same general vicinity as the other two, and the landscape looks very, very different. 5 years after the berry fire, when it reburned the 1988 Yellowstone fires, we have lost those tall standing dead snags. There's not a lot of small twigs left from the young trees that burned, and there's quite a lot of bare soil on the ground and less, or appearing to be less understory recovery. There's absolutely less tree recovery here. And this is contributing to, if we look now 12 years after the Bear Paw Bay fire, something that doesn't look anything like an area after long interval fire. Very few trees. Now, given enough time, maybe a couple of centuries, this might turn into a forest. But for now, it's incredibly sparse and appears just fundamentally changed as a result of the shortened fire return interval. Now, these fire return intervals, or pardon me, the short interval fires are quite well distributed across Greater Yellowstone since 1988. Again, kind of alluding to what may be coming as climate continues to change. And we see very clearly that it's having big impacts on post-fire tree establishment. But what about the rest of the plant community? Especially in Greater Yellowstone, most of the diversity of the plant community is found in the understory layer. How might some of those plants be responding to changing climate and changing fire return intervals? Just want to spend a little bit of time kind of conceptualizing what we might expect to see with changing fire return intervals and climate. So here on the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have some measure of plant communities. It can be really anything you want, but pretty much what I want it to represent is lower on that y-axis, you have plant communities that are more similar to meadows, shrublands, and steppe. And as you move up on that axis and plant communities, you're getting closer and eventually to plant communities that are more common in older forests. And so here we have an old forest plant community, this horizontal green line just chugging along, doing its thing. And then a fire occurs. And again, these systems are resilient. And so maybe the plant community dips away from what it was like pre-fire, but pretty quickly, given enough time, it will eventually recover to a very similar state because of its resilience to this fire regime. However, with these increasingly frequent fire return intervals, maybe we reburn the same area as it's on this trajectory back to its pre-fire state. That, again, you might expect would push that plant community away from an older growth forest plant community. Importantly, though, with these successive reburns, we might expect it to push it even further away. And then we might also see a longer time period that it might take for these plant communities to recover to their pre-fire state. We can't exactly test this with the data I'm going to present, but I think it's important to kind of conceptualize some of these changes that might be occurring. What if we then superimpose a warming climate? Here, climate going from blue to red, meaning moving from cool, wet to warmer and drier. What if after that second fire, the post-fire climate was actually much warmer and drier than that area had experienced historically? Will that actually push plant communities away even further and potentially keep them in this protracted state that is fundamentally different from what they were like pre-fire? Some of these broader questions are kind of what is driving this work. So how do climate and short interval fires generally affect post-fire plant communities in Greater Yellowstone? I'm going to give us a brief little roadmap here, just to kind of highlight some of the key questions that are guiding different sections of this work. First, we want to know, are communities more diverse, or are they less diverse following short interval fire? Are there more species or are there less species? Is there a different suite of species following short versus long interval fire? Are there different species that are unique only following short interval fire versus only following long interval fire? And then what about the common species, those species that are present in both short or following both short and long interval fire? How does their relative abundance compare in these two types of areas? And then we can think about actually grouping species into relevant categories. So how do groups of species like grasses or annuals fare following short versus long interval fire? And finally, how does climate then superimpose and interact with fire return interval to affect post-fire plant communities? We're going to be walking through these stepwise and then kind of return at the end to some major take-home messages that I have for you all. So to touch briefly on the methods we use to actually answer some of these questions, I've now included a series of points on the figure to the right. And all of these are plots that we visited this past summer. 62 total. And all of these plots were in these pairs. So we had 31 pairs. And within each pair, we have one plot that was in a plant community following short interval fire, and one plot that was in a plant community following long interval fire. And that's represented on this kind of blow up figure on the bottom left, where the short interval plant community is in red, and the long interval plant community is going to be in the white. So by pairing these plant communities, it's really helpful in that we can isolate fire return interval as the main thing we're interested in, because when we pair, we're able to control for a lot of other factors that otherwise might vary and affect some of the results that we get. So what do these plots actually look like? Well, they're 50 by 50 meters, and within each 50 by 50 meter plot, there are 3 parallel 50-meter transects that look something like this. And this is kind of a later stage developing forest. And along each of these transects, we have quarter-meter square quadrats that we set out every 5 meters. And we have a total of 25 quarter-meter square quadrats across the whole plot. And pretty much what we want to do is, it's unreasonable to expect that we can go across the whole plot and estimate the cover of plants across a whole 50 by 50 meter plot. So we want to kind of get a subset of the plot that is representative. This is what we do with these quadrats. So we set them down, and we're able to estimate the percent cover by species and non-species cover within the quadrat. So for this quadrat, taking as an example, we might have 8% fireweed, which is that bright purple flower you see here, 25% whortleberry, which is a cool shrub related to blueberries, 10% lupin, which is this palmately lobed plant you see in the bottom left part of the quadrat, 30% elk sedge, 2% pine grass. And so those are all of our plants. And then we also want to estimate non-plant cover. So here you can see we have some wood, about 6% wood, 15% charred litter, and finally 15% moss. And so by doing this, we're able to kind of get a snapshot of the plant community at this time period in this plot. And then we also walk throughout the whole plot to get a total plot richness, or a count of the number of species in each of these 62 plots. Diving right into the results, starting with our first question, thinking about diversity and richness. We identified 168 species across the 31 paired plots. And we wanted to see whether certain diversity metrics might differ between communities following short and long interval. And that far end, the significantly different part of this table was assessed using a paired t-test. And so, but I will just include a yes or no here. So for richness, following short interval, we found close to 37 species on average, and following long interval, close to 35. Now, there's a slight difference there, but it is not statistically significant. For Simpson's diversity, there is functionally no difference in diversity between these communities following short and long interval. And the same is the case for Simpson's evenness, which is similar to diversity, but it starts to think about what species might be dominating in the plot. So in essence, there's no difference in the richness or diversity between paired short and long interval plots. Well, these metrics are great for assessing kind of coarse scale trends, but species identity is really important, and species identity gets lost when we only think about richness or diversity. So what about those individual species, and how might individual species, how might they be responding? So first, starting with unique species. Of the 168 species we identified in total, 29 of them were unique following short interval. And I just want to kind of provide you with a subset of those, hoping that some of them might be familiar to you, and you might be interested to see them in relation to this question of fire return interval and climate. So following short interval, we found stonecrop as a unique species. This is really interesting because stonecrop is a succulent, it's a crassulacean species, typical in more open exposed habitats. Arrowleaf balsam root, which is similarly more common to meadows. Butter and eggs, a very common invasive species in the region that is found primarily in disturbed sites. Creeping Sebaldia, mountain hood pussytoes, Mountain tarweed, another annual that really likes disturbed sites, and common groundsel. This last one in particular, some of you might be familiar with and might react strongly to. I know it's a pretty aggressive invader in these areas, and similarly does like disturbed sites. And so, just to kind of generalize, many of these unique species following short interval fire tend to be those that like disturbance and like more open habitats, which kind of follows from our expectation based on what we saw between short and long interval fires. What about unique species following long interval? We identified 22 total, and just to name a subset of those, they include monkey flower, which is a common species to more mesic, wetter areas. I see it a lot streamside. Fernleaf licorice root, red elderberry, another, it's a shrub actually that really likes more mesic, wetter habitats. Clasp leaf twisted stalk, similar to red elderberry, likes wetter habitats. Sickletop lousewort, yellow columbine, beargrass. I want to take an aside for beargrass just because I'm so excited we found beargrass. This is a snapshot of iNaturalist showing the observations of beargrass for the state of Wyoming. And what you see by those little orangish squares are the only observations of beargrass in Wyoming being up in Grand Teton National Park, some of those observations being in our plots. So I just have to say, I'm just so excited that we found it, and I hope that y'all are seeing that it's a cool thing that we found it too. We also found mountain bog gentian. As you might be able to infer from its name, it likes wetter areas. Western Labrador tea, another species that likes wetter areas, and Pipsissewa, or prince's pine, which is a shrub common in forests. So again, thinking generally about these differences, this different suite of species between short and long interval, a lot of these species like kind of wetter habitats, and they also tend to like more shaded, typically forested habitats. So compare that to the drier, more disturbed preferences of some of the species I listed for short interval. We're already starting to see some differences in the suite of species following each of these fire return intervals. I also want to address some of the common species that we found to exhibit differences in their cover following short and long interval fire. Again, these are common in the sense that they were pretty widely distributed across our plots. Oftentimes, though, their total percent cover in the plot was relatively low, sometimes in the tenths of percents, but regardless, they were pretty cosmopolitan across our sampling. And so for each of the species, I'll have a picture on the left and a figure on the right. And to interpret this figure, you have our fire return intervals on either of these boxes, long on the left and short on the right. And typically, whichever one is higher than the other or extends higher than the other is the one that has greater cover of whatever species I'm presenting on here. So for elk sedge, this is probably one of the more widely distributed species that can at times really dominate plots. Its cover was greater following short interval compared to long interval fire. Same with silvery lupin, greater following short rather than long interval fire. A note too about lupin that some of you may be familiar with, but I hope all of you will find interesting. Lupin is one of the few species in Greater Yellowstone that can fix nitrogen. So it has symbiotic microorganisms in its root system. And it turns out that by hosting those symbionts, it's pretty expensive because the lupin, while it gets nutrients in the form of nitrogen from those organisms, it also has to house them and give them some of the food that it gets from its solar panels as leaves. And so it turns out that as a nitrogen fixer, lupin is pretty light demanding. And so it follows our expectation that it would occur in greater frequency following short interval where there tends to be fewer trees and more open habitat. Common yarrow is another species that was greater cover following short interval fire. This species is a really common non-native species, pretty cosmopolitan across North America. Little leaf pussy toes had greater cover, but as you see, kind of low cover overall. Narrowleaf Colomia had greater cover following short interval fire. This is a really common annual plant, so it just lives for 1 year and then dies. And same with spreading ground smoke. This is another species that was really common following short interval fire. That is also an annual. So it lives, flowers, reproduces, and that individual dies. Orange Agaceris, another species that does like open dry habitats. So we might expect, and we did find that it was greater following short interval fire, as was common harebell, another species that tends to like open habitats, exhibited greater cover following short interval fire. So that was 8 total species of our common Swedish species that exhibited greater cover following short interval. And we have 3 species that exhibited lower cover following short interval. Oregon grape is a shrub that did so. Heartleaf arnica, one of my favorite plants of Greater Yellowstone, also exhibited reduced cover following short interval fire. And same with white hawkweed, Hericium albiflorum. So we've looked at individual species, both in terms of unique species as well as some of our more common species. And that can absolutely be informative for how plant communities might be shifting. But we can gain even more insight when we start to group species into relevant categories. There's a couple categories that we grouped our species into, including growth form. So whether that species was a forb, a graminoid, or a shrub. Graminoids being grasses and sedges. What its lifespan was, whether it was an annual living 1 year, a biennial living 2 years, or a perennial living a few years or more, or whether it was native or non-native. And by doing so, we can start to infer some of the broader trends that we're seeing in potential shifts in plant communities. So focusing first on within the unique species, what we have are the number of unique species within each of these groups. So on the far left, we have them grouped by form. You see the forb, the graminoid, and the shrub. The middle, you see annual, biennial, and perennial. And on the far right, native and non-native. And on the y-axis are the number of species that fit those categories. And so focusing first on the far left, what we see is that unique graminoids are only found following short interval fire. This kind of follows from our expectations. Graminoids do tend to do better than some of these other species after successive disturbances. And still focusing on that graph on the far left, unique shrubs are largely found following long interval fire. There was only 1 unique shrub following short interval compared to 6 total species of shrub following long interval. Again, this follows some of our expectations and past work that has been done in Yellowstone and elsewhere, where shrubs do a really poor job at continuing to resprout after successive disturbance and can also be outcompeted. Moving on to the middle figure, looking at across lifespan, what we see is that our unique annuals and biennials are only found following short interval fire. Again, this kind of follows from some community ecology theory in that as you disturb more frequently and open up habitats, that's going to favor species that have shorter lifespans and reproduce more quickly. And then finally, moving on to the far right, we do see that unique non-natives are largely found following short interval fire. Again, 6 following short interval here, unique non-natives compared to only 1 unique non-native following long interval. I just want to touch on the non-natives really quickly because I think this is an interesting part of the story. It's actually something that Bill and I were communicating a bit over email earlier today. But this is a graph of the proportional non-native cover of plant communities, and each dot is a plant community, where by proportional non-native cover, I mean out of the total cover of a plant community, how much of it was made up of non-native species. And on our x-axis, we have a distance that plot was to a road or trail. And what we see is some of the highest proportional non-native covers in plant communities occur when we're 1.5 to 2 kilometers or less away from a road or trail. This kind of makes sense that you might introduce more of these non-natives that can be tracked in by humans, animals, cars, horses, things like that, to these areas that are closer to where those things are happening. However, it is important to note too that there are many plant communities that are that close to a road or trail, but they are not exhibiting a high proportion of non-natives, indicating that actually the plant communities here are showing some resilience to invasion in a sense by non-natives. At least some of them are. Now considering only our common species, still grouping it by form, lifespan, and status, focusing first on form. On the left, we have our forb cover, the middle, our graminoid cover, and the right, our proportional shrub cover. And what we see is across all of those quarter-meter square quadrats that I set down in each of those plots, absolute graminoid cover was significantly greater following short interval fire, and proportional shrub cover was significantly lower following short interval fire. So there are shifts in which species are occurring based on what their growth form is. Moving over to lifespan, we have annuals and perennials. I removed biennials from consideration just because we didn't have enough representation in that group. But a trend is still very clear here, where following short interval fire, a plant community is made up of proportionally more annuals and proportionally less perennials. Again, following from that expectation that species that reproduce quickly are going to do better in these habitats that are more open and more frequently disturbed. And then finally, cover by status. Similar to some of the results we've seen elsewhere, non-native cover increases following short interval fire. We can also think about grouping species by their tolerance levels. So here we're thinking about drought tolerance and shade tolerance. These are two relevant metrics because if we compare the conditions a plant is experiencing in an area following long interval fire versus short interval fire, you might expect following the long interval fire, just viewing these two images on the left, it's going to be a lot shadier on the forest floor. And typically that shade is going to confer greater moisture availability, or at least you're not going to have as much moisture stress because you're being shaded. Compare that to following short interval fire, it's going to be a lot more open, sunny, and typically drier. And past research has shown that soils following short interval fire are warmer and drier than those following long interval fire. So we're able to group our species or assign them categories of drought and shade tolerance, expecting that following short interval fire, we might expect communities to exhibit lower shade tolerance and greater drought tolerance. We did not see any difference in community drought tolerance, but we did see shifts in community shade tolerance, where there was a shift down in community shade tolerance following short interval fire. This follows from our expectations. Increasing sun, species that are not very tolerant of that sun are not going to do well, and species that are shade intolerant are likely going to outcompete those species that might be more shade tolerant. These categories are of course a little rough. We didn't actually go in and measure in any physiological way drought and shade tolerance. We assign these based on values pulled from the USDA plants database, but I do still think it's informative for how these plant communities are shifting. And finally, one last grouping that I want to touch on that we can think about how plant communities might be changing following short versus long interval fire is grouping plants into different vegetation zones. Greater Yellowstone spans a huge elevational gradient down from below 6,000 feet to up to 10,000 feet. And across this elevational gradient are distributed a bunch of different vegetation zones. At lower elevations, you see vegetation zones like plains and foothills, moving into lower montane, subalpine, and eventually alpine as you move up in elevation. And different plant species are going to do better and be better adapted to different vegetation zones. So take a species like fireweed. Fireweed's vegetation zone, according to the Plants of the Rocky Mountains, one of my favorite books from this summer that was very helpful, spans from the foothills at the bottom of its vegetation zone up to the subalpine zone at the top of its vegetation zone. So if we assign those numerical values, it spans from 2 to 4 with an average vegetation zone of 3. So if we assign these minimum, average, and maximum values to all plants in all of these plant communities, we might expect, or we can kind of get an average vegetation zone of the plant community. And we might expect that following short interval fire, because of the warmer, drier conditions, the more frequent disturbance, there could be an increase in the proportion of the plant community that is made up of species better adapted to those lower vegetation zones. This is just kind of a hypothesis. And to some extent, that hypothesis does bear out. So on the left, we have the average zone. In the middle, we have the minimum vegetation zone. And on the right, we have the maximum vegetation zone. And we see that the average vegetation zone of the plant community is significantly lower, marginally so, but it is lower following short compared to long interval fire. There are more species that can do better in lower vegetation zones. And this is largely driven by changes in the minimum vegetation zone of the plant community. So many of the species that are coming in after short interval fire can still do well at those higher vegetation zones. Their maximum is not changing, but they tend to be able to do better lower. And so this is indicative that there are shifts in the plant community occurring here. So for the last few minutes that I have, I do want to just touch on climate again. I think this is a really interesting part of the story. So again, bringing us back to, if we superimpose climate and change post-fire climate such that it's warmer and drier, do we see a continual pushing of the plant community away from its pre-fire state? Are we seeing kind of a widening of that gap? In other words, are plant communities becoming more and more dissimilar as a result of post-fire climate being potentially warmer and drier? We can actually measure plant community dissimilarity. If you think back to our methods, we had this neat plot pairing between long and short interval, and we can measure the dissimilarity between those paired plots using something called the Bray-Curtis Dissimilarity Index. Just to quickly visually represent this, Bray-Curtis measures the dissimilarity between two communities. Here we have community A and community B, and each shape is a different species. And already you can see these are different communities. Community A has the star-shaped species that is not present in community B. What's cool about the Bray-Curtis Index too is it also includes the relative abundance of different species. So it's also going to pick up the fact that that yellow circle in community B is very dominant, whereas in community A, it's present and appears to be doing well, but is no more dominant than, say, the green triangle. And if anything, the blue square is the most dominant. So we can take all of that information and put it into a single index that spans from 0 to no dissimilarity, or basically completely similar plant communities, the same plant communities, to 1, meaning that the plant communities are completely different from one another. What we found in our pairs is an average Bray-Curtis dissimilarity of 0.56. So there is absolutely considerable dissimilarity between these pairs. Now thinking about climate, how does post-fire climate affect that plant community dissimilarity across all of our pairs? So this is a figure that I just want to take a quick minute to walk through. So each dot is a plant community pair, so there's 31 total. On the y-axis, we have our Bray-Curtis dissimilarity, and on the x-axis is 3-year post-fire spring soil moisture anomaly. That is a mouthful, so we can kind of simplify it to think about, if we move left of that vertical dashed line, we are seeing post-fire spring soil moisture that is drier than typically occurs. And if we move right of that dashed line, we're seeing spring soil moisture that is wetter than what has typically occurred. And we see this positive relationship between dissimilarity and the soil moisture index, where wetter post-fire spring soils appears to contribute to increased dissimilarity. We can do the same for some measure of temperature. Here, 3-year post-fire maximum temperature anomaly. Again, just including those colored arrows to kind of simplify things. If you move left along the x-axis, you are getting to cooler post-fire maximum temperatures than have occurred historically. And if you move right, you're getting warmer post-fire maximum temperatures. And we again see a positive relationship where warmer post-fire maximum temperatures appears to contribute to increased dissimilarity. You may be wondering, I thought it was about warmer and drier, not wetter and dry, or pardon me, warmer and wetter. I do want to just kind of touch on a hypothesis that I have for why this might be the case. We can't directly test this hypothesis. We can't go in and mechanistically test it, at least from the data that we have. But it is a potential way of explaining why both of these factors are simultaneously contributing to increased community dissimilarity between short and long interval fire. So here we have two plant communities 5 years after the berry fire. And if spring soil moistures are anomalously high, we might expect quite a bit of soil moisture to build up in the soils post-fire. And with all of this available moisture, this might contribute to abundant plant establishment, expanding cover, and maybe even unique species that can actually establish in these plant communities. However, if that is then followed by a really warm summer in both of these, the plant communities might actually be experiencing a different climate. And this is where we start to think about differences in macroclimate, the broader climate, and microclimate, the climate or the conditions that the plant is actually experiencing. So in that shady long interval forest, as those water levels draw down, that shade might keep water levels from drawing down as much as they would in the areas following short interval fire because it's so exposed. And this could contribute to those plants in the areas following short interval fire to experience a lot warmer and a lot drier microclimate than those in the areas following long interval fire, leading to differences in the number that are actually dropping out. And so actually contributing to quite a bit of dissimilarity being present in these communities. Again, this is just a hypothesis that I have, something that would be really cool to test, but climate is, there's a lot of factors involved in climate. And of course, macroclimate and microclimate are different things to measure. So this is definitely a story that needs to continue to be investigated and told. So that is what I have for you. We covered a lot of ground, so I just want to come back to a few main points. The first point I want to make isn't even a result of my study, but I do think it is such an important thing to take away from this still. Climate is warming and fire is becoming more common across Greater Yellowstone. And you could actually replace Greater Yellowstone with lots of different places throughout the Western United States, but this is a huge thing that we're seeing happen. These changes are leading to shifts of individual species abundance, where they are and how much where they occur, and then contributing to shifts in whole plant communities, with indications of increased prevalence by non-natives, greater cover by grasses and sedges, and more species capable of surviving in lower vegetation zones following short compared to long interval fire. And finally, post-fire climate interacts in interesting and unique ways with short interval fire to further affect plant communities. With that, I want to thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate all the folks for taking time out of their evening to spend with us, and I am happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. That was terrific. I think your visuals were really clear to walk us through a lot of data, but it made sense, it held together, and I think your whole piece of interest in translational ecology, trying to get people to understand it, was very well done. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I think it's maybe a little easier if people put them in the chat. We'll see how many pop up. And what I can do, Nathan, if this helps you, I can sort of try to read them for you so you don't have to keep looking at the chat. You can concentrate on the answer.
Sure.
One from Kay, who always has very good questions. Is there a transport mechanism that permits more unique species for long-term fire zones? So is there a transport mechanism that permits more unique species for long-term fire zones, such as the return of birds or other species with seeds?
That is a really excellent question. So what I would expect is that, at least in the context of short and long interval fire, some of the unique species might be those that are more wind dispersed, that might be coming in so they're going to be more broadly dispersed. But I think thinking about the non photosynthesizing community and how that also plays a role in what comes back is incredibly interesting. I know, I mean, white bark pine is one of those species, a tree, not in the understory, that has its seeds dispersed by birds, and so does interact with wildlife and how it's distributed. But I think I can say a little bit less of some of these less widely distributed understory plants. I hope that answers your question.
And then she says, I have heard of short-term fires also following the accompany of more storm-related wet periods that would possibly wash away soils that are not firmly set with plant life. Do you think this is an issue?
Another really good question. Yeah, I think that I could see it being an issue in localized areas, but potentially not super widespread across the landscape. So thinking maybe steeper slopes that might be easily more eroded or more easily eroded away. But yeah, I think that it could definitely be a thing. I just think there might be other drivers of change that will have a bigger impact than that necessarily.
And we have a question here. Did you assess the changes in the mycorrhizal community?
We did not. We actually, there's a whole new project coming on board, recently funded by the National Science Foundation, that's trying to look at biogeochemical cycling generally. Basically, how do these really dense lodgepole pine forests get all of their nitrogen? Because this is not a very nutrient-rich system, as many of you are familiar with. It's quite dry. It's dusty. There's not a lot of organic material necessarily. So how are they getting all this nitrogen? And then also, how might that nitrogen stock in the trees ratchet down? And part of what we're thinking about for how they get the nitrogen is those mycorrhizal associates, potential fungal associates in the leaves. They're called endophytic symbionts, different lichens and crusts and mosses. There's a graduate student in our lab who's going to be looking at that community more than I, and I'm envious of it. It's a really cool project.
Terrific. Mike Murigliano, who's been around a long time looking at fires in wetland areas, how did you control for inherent site differences, such as wet sites may have longer fire intervals?
An excellent question. I think we're able to get around that to some extent with our paired design, in that within the pair of long and short interval, we controlled for site conditions like that. So the elevation was very comparable, the slope was very comparable, and the aspect was very comparable within those pairs, just trying to control for that fire return interval. And actually then we wanted to distribute pretty widely across that range of sites, because we wanted to know, does a wetter site have a different trajectory if you reburn it in short succession than a drier site, expecting maybe those that are already drier might change more, or they might have an increase in species adapted to warmer and drier conditions. So it's controlled, but it's also still a factor. You can never remove it totally from a field study like this.
And we're still looking at soils. Did you look at soil burn severity maps of each fire? Could they play a part on why some vegetation did not recover?
Yeah, so soil burn severity in the system is measured a little bit differently. So soil burn severity is important, like the depth of the burn is important. However, the soils are so thin in Greater Yellowstone that for the most part, the whole organic horizon and the whole top horizon is burned off in most fires. When we think about severity in the system, it's the proportion of trees that were killed, and that's going to have a bigger impact on plant community succession after fire. Soil severity, though, is really important, or soil burn severity is really important up in the boreal forest. You have incredibly deep soils, like just peat buildup. And it's actually super cool to read about the repeat burns that occur in the boreal forest, because typically what you're seeing is when you burn more of that top layer of soil away, you start to see an increase in aspens recovering as opposed to some coniferous tree species. So I think it could play a part here on a small scale, but potentially not on as big a scale as something like burn severity considered from the tree's perspective.
Has your research affected restoration efforts and species that are added to burn sites to restore them? This is from Bettina.
Yeah, I will say the short answer is no. I think people who are doing more of that management side of things are actually on this call. Becky Smith, fire ecologist at Yellowstone National Park, and Diane Abendroth, both of whom are really interested in what's coming back after these fires and beginning to think about how to manage for a world with more fire. So I think in a sense, our research in providing them with lists of species that are or are not coming back after short interval fire is informative. But they're really the folks who are thinking about management on the ground. It's interesting too to think about management. This is a wilderness setting that I did this study in, being the national parks for the most part. And so most active management is not typical historically. The goal is to let natural processes play out. But in areas that burn in the surrounding national forest where management, post-fire management might be more intensive, you could see potentially greater ability to go in and actually like replant trees or cast in native seeds or something like that. But that's a whole other, I mean, I could spend a whole nother PhD on that topic.
Just to conclude here, I think Amy Taylor just wants to say how thrilled she is that you located bear grass. And did you document those new locations? So they're in the herbarium somewhere and good things like that?
Amy, I am thrilled too. I was so excited to see it. I posted or put them on iNaturalist. And so I didn't actually collect any specimens or collect any parts of specimens other than the pictures, just because if we found one, it was only one or two. And so I didn't feel compelled to pull it out. So not in terms of like an herbarium specimen, but we did document their locations.
Terrific. Any other questions from anybody?
I agree, Steve. Fire ecology is great.
Yeah. And you're great, Nathan. You've done a terrific job, and it's a lot of intensive questions and a lot of work to get
thank you,
what
Francis.
done. And I know you have other pieces of this you're working on as well. So,
yeah.
And you're going to be back here this summer.
Yep.
So maybe
and I more to share next spring.
Terrific. That would be great. And maybe Amy and I can take you and Becky and Diane out to supper or dinner in Jackson, if we can get you all together sometime over the summer in appreciation of all the work that you've done and for your presentation this evening. And so with that, I think I see lots of people very thrilled, but they're beginning to sign off because it's dinner time. And I think, Nathan, if you could press the record button so we're offline here, that would be great.